Hello and welcome to Short Circuit. Yes, this is Short Circuit live from YIMBYTown. Where is YIMBYTown? Well, this year, 2025, on September 15th, it is in New Haven, Connecticut. We are here at the Omni Hotel in New Haven, Connecticut for YIMBYTown, a gathering of, I believe, over 1,000 people, record number at this conference, to talk about, yes, in my backyard. How can we have more homes in the United States in 2025? And so we have some very distinguished folks on the panel to talk about not the latest cases from the federal courts of appeals, as we usually do on Short Circuit, but cases and controversies from around the country. Now, I was talking to my friend Ari Bargil here, who's on the panel, before we started, and we realized that we're going to be talking about some cases that are trying to stop homes from being built, and some cases that are trying to allow more homes to be built. So it's kind of how you can see the courts and litigation are a double-edged sword, which is pretty obvious, but something we forget about sometimes. So you're going to hear about a couple cases where NIMBYs are using the courts, but also a couple cases where YIMBYs are using the courts. And we have some very distinguished folks, so I'll give incredibly short introductions to David Schleicher of Yale Law School, the Walter E. Meyer Professor of Property and Urban Law, Andrew Fine of Open New York, he's Chief of Staff and Policy Director, and my colleague Ari Bargil, who is a senior attorney at the Institute for Justice. So we're going to start with Professor Schleicher, and he has this fancy title that I just gave him, but I believe really your title these days is Professor of YIMBYism? I mean, you're like the YIMBY professor. That's on your door.
I mean, if I could get that title, I'd be happy to take it. So it would be an honor. So I'm going to talk about the latest iteration in a case you've actually talked about on the podcast before, a case called Maid versus Montana, this is the latest iteration in the litigation that followed the passing of the Montana Miracle, which was a series of land use reforms that went through the Montana legislature. And as often happens with new deregulatory legislation, it immediately got challenged in the court by a newly created group, this case called Montanans Against Irresponsible Densification. The case you guys talked about was the state Supreme Court, the only state Supreme Court case thus far. So it was immediately challenged at the trial level, and the trial court judge granted a preliminary injunction against the enforcement of the law. I'll get into the content in a minute, but the key was finding irreparable injury, and the irreparable injury he found was the possibility that you'd wake up one morning and gasp, see an ADU across the road, and you would suffer as a result irreparable injury from the existence of someone living near you. The state Supreme Court reverses this and finds no irreparable injury, but they still have to rule. It goes back to the trial court level to rule on the merits decision, which is there in fact any legal problems with the law? And they come up with a mixed outcome. The first thing ruling, and I chose this case to talk about because I think it highlights some of the new edge issues in YIMBYism, in the sense that there are
like crystals and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. These are the issues that are going to be taking people's attention, particularly in the wake of successful legislative efforts. Like, what's next? And so there are going to be a couple issues that come up. So the first issue in the litigation was whether applying a deregulatory rule created an equal protection violation against people who did not live in covenanted areas, housing not covered by a homeowners association. And the theory of the case that the trial court initially gave a great deal of credence to, but eventually rejects, is that there's some problem if some people don't live in areas that are densifying after the deregulation because of they're protected by a covenant from that possibility, and other people do. And if this argument sounds stupid, you're right. It's a very stupid argument. But it is an argument that some courts have given credence to. For instance, an Ohio court, in a slightly different procedural context governing Ohio's home rule provisions, have said that there's something wrong with deregulatory rules that don't also violate the terms of private covenants. Interesting argument. The court also noted in their first opinion that it would be said that if the law did affect covenants, it would be a contract clause violation. And that is going to be a huge issue for a number of states. There's reasons I'll get into in one second. The second thing the court dealt with was, did the law created a situation in which public participation was allowed at the kind of city plan staging, but not at the situation of project approval, where they declared that that was ministerial. And under the Montana Constitution, there's a particularly unique legal regime that gives people a state constitutional right to participate before any final decision is made, if that final decision involves any discretion. And this is a weird rule. There are some states that have something a little bit like it under their environmental protection rules, like the new right to the environment that approach in Pennsylvania and New York. It's a little similar. And the court here said that a rule that made final approval, site approvals ministerial, violated this constitutional provision. So that part of the Minnesota law was thrown out. That will be appealed on a cross appeal. And so that's the second issue.
You mean Montana?
Montana. Sorry, I got that wrong.
Minnesotan here a little.
Yeah, but I apologize. I'm from New York, and there's it's like the famous New Yorker cartoon: 5th Avenue, 6th Avenue, 7th Avenue, 8th Avenue, 9th Avenue, 10th Avenue, 11th Avenue, China, because it's like all the same. And the third thing that emerges is just the general problem of state trial courts. So this state trial court, the judge had ruled in the first stage, held up the law for what it eventually had to acknowledge were pretty spurious reasons. And so I want to highlight all three of these issues as problems we're going to have to deal with going forward, or they're going to be issues going forward. So the question of discrimination against covenants that's a weird idea. The idea that that covenants are a separate legal regime from land use law. You can have a covenant inside but the broader idea of how states are going to deal with covenants that stop redevelopment is going to be a huge conflict. California, for instance, has passed laws that bar HOAs from banning pets. It's a longstanding rule, and that's a regulation of those covenants. They've also required them to allow ADUs to be built. Whether the court's initial decision that doing so would violate the Constitution, because it is a private contract or something kind of like that, is going to be at the edge as we see deregulatory efforts see and reveal other limitations that exist. And so areas that are, whether there can be redevelopment of areas that are governed by covenants is going to be an issue, because almost all new single-family houses in America are built with covenants. So it is a very large majority of new housing, and so that's been true for a number of years. And a lot of these areas are now kind of due for redevelopment, but we don't know what's going to happen. The question of participation, I think, has been very present in YIMBY discussions for years, but the challenges that emerge by the fact that participation is biased and it doesn't even match the electorate, never mind the broader population. But the question of should we limit public participation is going to, at least at the site-specific stage, is going to be a conflict we deal with in a lot of places because there's going to be a lot of interest in doing so. The final thing, and I think the thing that might be most interesting for us all to talk about, is that state trial court judges all around the country, for using different doctrinal rules, have become kind of the leading, like kind of the tip of the NIMBY spear across lots of issues. So you see this in some cases. The issue will arise in hyper-technical elements of environmental law. For those of you who are from Virginia, have seen the Arlington and Alexandria litigation about this. Sometimes it's just judges pretending. We'll get into some New York instances and example, just saying they don't want to follow the law. So a well-known judge just said about one project, he said, I don't care what the zoning says, you can't build that here.
And I've lived in New York my entire life.
Yeah,
so I know.
Yeah, I've lived in New York, exactly. And the challenge that emerges for these trial judges is that it can seem kind of complex and hard in certain ways, but if you think about where they come from, which is generally true across different methods of appointing them, they are mostly selected by local party organizations. And that's true whether they're directly elected in very uncompetitive elections, like you see in Montana, or whether they're elected in a bizarro process the way they're done in New York, or whether they're appointed as they are in Virginia, but are done through a version of member deference, effectively, where the individual assembly people can choose or state senators can choose the members. And so this broader problem of judges making up reasons to oppose law is going to be a problem. And so across all three of these issues, we see in the kind of private land use controls and covenants, the participatory problems, and the kind of general problem of kind of somewhat lawless state trial court judges. We see this to show up here.
So, Andrew, your controversy you're going to talk about is similar in some ways, but curious of your thoughts, maybe more globally, thinking of the Montana issue and the three problems that David outlined, how we might think about solving those issues going forward.
Yeah. The case I want to talk about also has a NIMBY trial court judge, so we'll definitely tap into that. I think it goes to a piece that David wrote recently for the argument, really focusing on the electoral side of trial court judges and how we as YIMBYs might look to electing different judges, right? We have talked a lot about electing pro-housing legislators and executives, but really haven't talked about that on the judicial side. Because of how complicated the processes are and how state constitutions have made them very convoluted, it is not easy to jump into that side of the electoral process. So I want to bring up the other side, which is you can also restrict the rights to bring private actions. You can restrict the types of controversies that the trial court judges can look at. So that's something I'm going to talk about in my case, is how we reform the environmental review laws so that trial court judges can't block more projects under, state seeker bills, like, reforms that have happened recently in California and also at a smaller level in New York City. So yeah, I was wondering, David, if you wrote about the electoral side, but also want to hear your thoughts on restricting what subject matters the trial court.
One of the things I think is interesting is that the people act like the politics and strategy around litigation is somehow structurally different from the things that people are doing on the legislature. But I actually think it's quite similar in a lot of ways, which is when we think about the challenge of like local opposition in city councils, we think about either giving greater power to the executive as one source, like local executives, or alternately creating types of kind of cleaner rules that preempt. In this case, you're seeing they have a similar type of solution. So one type of idea is to make the laws like reduce discretion across one way or another, which is the kind of thing you're talking about. The other one is to kind of, as you know, get in the mix. And one of the things you see in the Montana case is you have a bunch of groups, including our hosts, getting involved in litigation and being kind of constant players in the fight. And this is going to be an increasingly important issue in this litigation because you do see a pretty structural version where the trial court judges are much more restrictive than the higher level appeals court judges for reasons that are quite similar to why you see city councils being more restrictive than either mayors or higher level legislators. And it requires kind of ongoing pressure from permanent organizations, in this case litigation organizations, but in the political side, political organizations, to keep pressing the issue and not giving up because it's, you face one setback or one person delaying or whatever. And so I think there's a lot of similarity between the litigation problems and the political problems once you take away a little bit of the gloss of the judicial things. They come with opinions, the people wear robes. But once you stop pretending any of that is actually makes things that much different, particularly when the judges are making up the rules in certain instances and playing Calvin ball. It actually looks very similar to what people are talking about when they're talking about legislative strategy.
So Ari, you are one of these people in the mix in the Montana case. Your thoughts before we move on.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is emerging here is sort of a NIMBY playbook, for lack of a better term. And we're all getting very, very familiar with not only the arguments that they make in front of city councils, but now some of the arguments that they're making both offensively and defensively in court. I'll talk about it a little bit when I get to my case, a little bit later on. But one of the things that's always struck me about the Made litigation is that this is just a rehashing of older arguments that were made by other groups that didn't like deregulation. Anthony and I and others in the room are old enough to remember a world without Uber. And when a lot of the ride-sharing deregulation was coming in, the taxi cartel was very, very upset. And they were angry that their medallions were being devalued after having had the benefit of this state-created monopoly for so long. And they came into court and they said, our constitutional rights are being violated. This is a taking because our medallion that was worth $200,000 is now worth pennies. Government, do something about it. And the response from groups like mine and others was, you don't have a constitutionally actionable property interest in your membership or participation in a cartel. And that's what Made's arguments really are, is saying, look, we've got a property interest and it's being affected by the government allowing other people, including us, by the way, to have more rights. And that's just not how constitutional rights work.
So the idea of having a right to a regulatory regime is like formally not true, and in practice is quite true, right? So it is felt as a property right, in that people feel like they have a property right to existing zoning regulations, just as the taxis felt like they had a right to not have more medallions or not have kind of more competition. And so what you're seeing in court is frequently the trial court judges are accepting the folk idea of a right rather than the kind of normal legally actionable version of it. And that is an interesting phenomenon. You'd think the court should apply what the actual law is, not the folk understanding of what the law is. But sometimes it goes one way, sometimes it goes the other.
When this issue came up a few years ago, but after a lot of this taxi litigation had happened, some of which I participated in, I wrote just a blog post, but it's one of the pieces of writing where I've gotten the most feedback in my career, and it was titled something we've long said at IJ, which is, there's no such thing as a deregulatory taking. So if you give someone else more rights, it doesn't affect you and takes away anything you have. It just makes more competition or whatever. That doesn't that you don't have a cause of action. Now that's true in the taxi medallion context, but it's also true in the zoning context. And I got some pretty irate emails in response to that about having some Section 8 housing moving in down the street, and I get the kind of vibes where those people were coming from, but I politely did not write them back and sent them on their way.
Is that polite? I don't know. Seems kind of jackassy to me.
Sometimes it was, thank you for your comments. But now we're going to hear Andrew's comments about a similar matter, but in the Big Apple.
Yeah, so I want to talk about a case that I've worked on and off on for about 13 years, unfortunately, which is Friends of the Elizabeth Street Garden versus the City of New York. Yeah,
the gaffes were amazing there. Exactly. That was great.
Many people might know about this case because it has been in the press so often, including endless articles in the New York Times. But just for a little background, we're talking about a half-acre lot, about 20,000 square feet in Lower Manhattan. Now a very, expensive and shishi kind of place to live. Back in the day, it was tenement housing for immigrants, and the city owned a large lot that was bigger than this 20,000 square feet. It included a school. That school was demolished in the 1970s, and about 2/3 of the property was occupied by one of the first LIHTC developments in the city. And so, I actually don't know the history why the rest of the lot was left empty. I suspect it's because the city just didn't have the money in 1980 to build a bigger building. So 20,000 square feet was left empty. It turned into a sort of a grassy chained link property. And of course, in the story of gentrification, what happened on Elizabeth Street was that a fancy antique store opens. It's always sort of the front of gentrification is antiques. And so this store said, hey, I would love to show my beautiful, pagodas and my sculptures of lions and stones, and I want a space for that. And I want to show, the new celebrities who are moving into Soho and Gordon Geckos that they can put on their roof and in their backyard. So I would like to use this lot. And the city's like, well, sure, we don't have any use for it, and money, we'll give it for you for $1 a year. And so from 1991 to 2012, that's what it was. It was a fancy outdoor antiques gallery. It was still chain link fence, closed off. No one could access it unless you went to the store, which was not accessible, to the public. I lived up the block there. I would walk by it a lot and just didn't think about it. Then in 2012, the city is obviously very different. They're in a housing crisis. The city is much wealthier. And the demand and the need for affordable housing has grown immensely since 1981. And so the Bloomberg administration identifies the lot as the place where they would like to build affordable housing, 100% deeply affordable housing. And so this 13-year process begins, right? 2012, in 2014, as HPD, which is the agency that builds this housing, was getting going on the project, neighbors nearby, along with the gallery owner, say, well, why don't we open it up? Why don't we a few hours a week on occasional weekends will let the public in, enjoy the space, and maybe that will create pressure to not build housing here. And that's when the Friends of the Elizabeth Street Garden, the nonprofit, was formed. HBD kept on going. They held community events. They RFP'd the project. 2016, 2017, 2018, I'll get to how long it takes to build affordable housing in our cities, particularly on city-owned land. And then finally in 2019, they're ready to go. And the Friends of Elizabeth Street Garden sue. And unfortunately, they, as David was talking about, they get a NIMBY trial court judge who blocks it and then takes 3 years to issue a decision. This is not a complicated case. It is the only way they could bring this litigation was environmental review, saying that this infill housing in one of the densest parts of the country, the most transit-oriented parts of the country, would cause environmental harm, even though a large portion of the property was going to be after the housing gets built, 123 deeply affordable units for seniors. A large portion, 7,000 square feet of the property, would be used as a public park, open to the public 24/7, properly managed by the Parks Department instead of this sort of quasi nonprofit. And the court says they didn't take enough time in all those years to review the environmental harms that might be caused by this development.
Is there an endangered species in that part of
there
the
is,
city?
yeah. Well,
yes, affordable housing.
Low-income people, yes. And so 3 years trial court, a year in the appellate division. The appellate division comes back saying this is ridiculous, overturning the trial court. A year later, 2024, the New York State Court of Appeals, which is the highest court, gives a very mundane ruling saying, yeah, the trial court was crazy. This was clearly looked at enough, move forward with the decision. There is a very interesting dissent that I do recommend to people that really shows a different vision of how we fight climate change than is really discussed here, which is, was sort of emphasizing the need for the agency to think more about climate change and how this open space, the loss of the open space might harm the climate, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very different vision of the future.
Come again?
I'm just saying, I think it's important to understand the worldview that's in the dissent. Yeah. But anyway, it's 6-1 decision. Telling the trial court they should have allowed this housing to move forward 2024. So finally, you would think after 12 years, the city would put shovels in the ground and get this housing built. Unfortunately, because they're such wealthy neighbors, they come with different lawsuits. They come with a lawsuit in housing court to prevent the eviction.
There's no res judicata, or these are different neighbors?
No, same neighbors, but different claims. So now they're coming in housing court to prevent the eviction. They file a claim in federal court under the Visual Rights Act, saying that taking away the sculptures will erase the art that has been created in the garden.
Yeah.
So they
site-specific rights. This is like Richard Serra, but it's but about pagodas.
So that delays things. And finally, unfortunately, as many people know, the mayor of New York City has had some legal problems, and he brings on a new staffer that, as a first deputy mayor, who decides, I got different priorities. I don't want to fight Robert De Niro and Patti Smith and all these other
Scorsese. Scorsese was involved,
and all the children who've been roped in to write postcards that the New York Times covered. Anyway, so they just said, okay, we're canceling the project after millions and millions of dollars spent by Habitat for Humanity, by all the agencies. Just tons and tons of staff time have worked on this over 13 years to build 123 deeply affordable homes for seniors. There are no new construction apartments in this neighborhood for people to move in who need elevator, who need services. Cancel the project, cancel the new open space. We've had a lot of momentum in New York City on much bigger things, which I'm really excited about. But this is sort of like a clear example of the NIMBY-YIMBY fight, and how long it takes to build affordable housing is something that I've been thinking a lot about, and the different barriers that came in the way to this. Go to what David was saying about NIMBY judges, about seeker and the environmental review processes that we have that allow this litigation to last for years. And also there's the process to build affordable housing, and there are referenda on the ballot this year in New York City that will try to make it faster, that are really important.
So my question about is that there's a specific to New York problem here, which is the specific power of NIMBY celebrities, which has become a giant problem across all of New York City. So they're roving. They're not in fact specific to neighborhoods. So De Niro is from the neighborhood, but Mark Ruffalo goes all over the city opposing new projects. The Hulk literally destroying.
I believe he lives next to the Upper West Side Church that he was trying to break. So
so that's more local. It's but the question is like, how do you propose dealing with this problem of dealing with? It's not merely well-funded people; it's people who have infinite access to the press that can therefore take advantage of delays to change the politics.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and it's why we have invested a lot in our comms department. We have an amazing team. And
do you have your own celebrities?
Well, eventually, we this afternoon. Elijah Fox, who works for Councilmember Chiose, is speaking about the videos that he has created and his team has created that have millions of views across the country to shape the narrative over housing.
And just like Goodfellas.
No, but it is different. It is how we shape the narrative is really important. And the Friends of the Elizabeth Street Garden were really good about making this a fight between open space and housing. Like the New York Times headline when the Court of Appeals came out was, it was public space versus affordable housing, a court chooses housing, right? And the fact is, you look at the drawings, you look at the floor plans, you look at everything. This is both. This is not a trade-off. You have affordable housing on a small footprint. The beauty of density is you can just use a little portion of this lot to build 123 apartments. And then you have beautiful open space that would have been public parks for everyone. You don't have to choose one or the other, but they framed it that way. They really framed it as, there's giant banners on the lot saying "Save the Elizabeth Street Garden," and it became this thing. And you would talk to friends, "Oh, you're trying to destroy the garden. Oh, this kind of thing." And I think how we work as a community and a movement to reframe things that it's not zero sum, it's not mutually exclusive. You really can have both. Is something that I think is really important.
So, Ari, curious of your thoughts before we move on to maybe a happier lawsuit.
Yeah, I was talking before about the NIMBY playbook. My God, if there's ever a page that you want to pull out of it, if you're a NIMBY, not to give tips, it's get third graders to write cutesy letters to the mayor. And Martin Scorsese on his own letterhead, which is impressive in its own right. No, I think what's sad about this, New York City being, I think, perhaps the cradle of NIMBYism nationally, is that it's going to be a caution.
We got some Californians in the room.
True,
I saw a lot of faces go. Be like, don't try to take that from us too.
I don't want to start a
giving
civil
some dagger eyes right there.
I don't want to start a civil war, but in any case, both very bad places. But this is, I think this could serve as a cautionary tale to local governments who are wondering what to do with unused, undeveloped land. I mean, the thing that sort of gets forgotten here is that the Friends of the Elizabeth Garden didn't own this land. They were leasing it, and it was something that the government.
No, they weren't even leasing it.
They weren't.
The gallery, the sculpture garden was leasing it. They were just a nonprofit that formed of neighbors nearby.
Right, and I guess what I'm driving at is that back in the '80s, if the government didn't have the ability to develop it or whatever, they could have let it sit idle and abandoned, which any urbanist will tell you is probably the worst thing that you can do with a plot of land. But I fear that that's what will happen now, because if you allow some sort of a productive use, be it by a nonprofit or a non-owner, then that use is going to become entrenched and they're going to fight whatever it is that you try to do with the land later.
It's in fact worse under New York law. So New York has a particular version of something called the public trust doctrine, which is different from the regular public trust doctrine, which says that if something gets used as a public park, to decommission it as a public park, you have to get an act of the state legislature. And so if you allow, and so there's a litigation involving NYU that dealt with this, which is even if the city keeps it platted as going to be used for housing, doesn't ever change it, but puts swings And I think so people can use it in the interim, that it at least plausibly becomes a park and then requires a vote of the state legislature to be decommissioned. And so in that litigation, they have to be very clear that the city and NYU eventually won that litigation, but it's a very close question. And the challenge is if you start using it, allowing people onto property, then potentially you can never stop.
The comments about the celebrities remind me, David probably knows more of this than I do, but that in the pole star of modern takings cases, Penn Central, wasn't Jackie O at the front of leading the charge against redeveloping the station?
Yeah, it was after Penn Station got knocked down. That's the source of that. New York can take that. It's the real driver of historic preservation law, and that is and then she was involved in they were in the Penn Central case.
So Ari's going to take us down to Georgia now, and they all they wanted was some tiny homes. And
That's
then
right.
What happened?
That's right. This is, we talked a little bit earlier about state trial judges, which I think are a little bit of a mixed bag. And I think this is a case where the outcome is quite positive. So this is an IJ case. It's an organization called Tiny House Hand Up versus Calhoun County, Georgia. We represent a woman named Cindy Tucker, who is the head of a nonprofit called Tiny House Hand Up. And all she wanted to do was build some modest Southern-style cottages, or tiny homes, depending on your terminology, of about 540 to 600 square feet on a green field in Calhoun County, Georgia. The area was surrounded by warehouses and commercial uses. The only problem being that Calhoun County requires any home that's being built to be no fewer than 1,150 square feet. So she goes in front of the government. We know that we're not going to get this variance, but we feel like we have to apply because part of the NIMBY playbook is always whatever you didn't do, that's the thing that you were 100% supposed to do, which is consistent with constitutional litigation in general, where whatever you argue or wherever you bring your claim, the government's initial response is, you can't argue that here. You should have argued that somewhere else. You should have filed this somewhere else. Before you filed this lawsuit, you needed to file another lawsuit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these are the things that we have to contend with as public interest lawyers. So she seeks a variance, and the variance goes in front of the zoning board. And the support is pretty overwhelming in favor of the project. And the zoning board, uncharacteristically, decides not to make a recommendation one way or the other to the city council and the mayor. They just enter some findings of fact and conclusions of law. There's some support, there's some opposition. They come in and they say, well, this is going to lead to crime and low-income people coming into our neighborhoods, and God forbid we can't have that. So it goes to the city council and the mayor, of course, and the city council deny the variance. And there it's a little bit more vitriolic. The term riffraff gets thrown around a little bit. The concerns about property values, which are ever present, even though completely hollow and illegitimate, also carry the day. And thankfully for Cindy Tucker and Tiny House Hand Up, IJ is there every step of the way, and now we sue. And we file this lawsuit in Georgia State Court under the Georgia Constitution. We also challenge the decision of the City Council to deny the variance, but we bring some constitutional claims as well, challenging the legitimacy of the minimum square footage law. And basically, the thrust of the argument is that there is no legitimate government interest in forcing homes to be of a certain size. It's incompatible with the International Building Code, local codes. There's nothing health and safety related. And for the government to be doing anything that's legitimate, it needs to do things in a way that are reasonably or substantially related to a legitimate government interest. Here, they don't have a legitimate government interest. And even if they did, imposing a minimum square footage law is not reasonably or substantially related to that interest. I'm happy to announce that this case was decided a few weeks ago by a state trial judge in Georgia, and we won. My colleague Joe Gay at the Institute for Justice argued this masterfully. We're waiting for a decision from the trial judge. He ruled from the bench saying, you guys win, which is always such an incredible feeling and is rather atypical. You often wait weeks, months, years for these decisions, and we're still waiting for the opinion to come out. But one of the things that the government did in oral argument was basically, after having conceded that they were effectively beat on substantive due process under the Georgia Constitution, tried to move the goalposts a little bit. And they tried to say, well, actually, Your Honor, what they could have done was this other thing, and they didn't apply for it. And that's where good litigation comes in, and getting out in front of NIMBY arguments comes in, because our response to that was, the thing you just said that we were supposed to do We asked you if we could do it before we filed this lawsuit, and you categorically said no. And here's the page in the record where we have that email from you, and the judge saw that and was having none of the government's argument and basically said, you can't change the goalposts in the middle of your argument. You can't argue things that are completely belied by the record. And so IJ is going to win, Cindy Tucker is going to win, and we're waiting for the ruling there.
So I have a quick question before we go to the rest of the panel, Ari, and that is people in the room with some legal background. Of course, a lot of listeners will be wondering, that sounds like a rational basis case. I thought you can't win a rational basis case against the government, and your answer is, but in Georgia you can because... Because
the Georgia Supreme Court has said that the rational basis test under the Georgia Constitution provides greater scrutiny than its federal counterpart, which is a really important thing and something that's emerging. People like Anthony talk about this a lot. We can talk about this a lot here. But this is an emerging trend in the state high courts throughout the country and is incredibly important for people who do the type of work.
And it applies in lots of kinds of cases, like a lot of, say, 20 years ago, a lot of the gay rights cases were decided under state constitutions under this kind of standard. But it applies to land use as well. And so I hope, if you learn one thing from the panel today is maybe your own state constitution, it can be bad in some ways, like in, the Montana right to know might gum up the works on trying to get more housing, but it can be a sword that you can use in your own states as well.
And we would argue, sorry to cut you off, and we would argue that the iteration of the rational basis test that's applied in a state like Georgia or in Texas, for example, is actually the correct version of the test that all courts should be applying. The federal courts haven't been super receptive to that, but like I said, there's a trend emerging in the state courts, and we're working to continue to push that trend in the right direction.
Yeah, great case and great outcome. I'm just curious where you think is next if this sticks around. I mean, in New York City, there was a big debate recently over what they call dwelling unit factor and minimum square footages in some of our low density areas. We made a lot of zoning changes to allow more housing and more flexibility. But in cities, there's still a lot of fear of single room occupancy and SROs and the whether or not it's legitimate to regulate the minimum size of apartments, in order to ostensibly protect health and safety, but in many times has been used just to exclude poor people and to push out people from...
Also young people.
And young people. Push out many people that are deemed undesirable. So I'm curious where you think this might go next.
So I'm not sure I can cite a specific geographic locale where I think this is headed. But I think anywhere where you're able to come into court and demonstrate with evidence that there is no legitimate public health or safety justification behind a law, and it's conceivable at least that maybe somewhere some of these restrictions might make sense. But in a place like Calhoun County, Georgia, on a greenfield, in a state that's suffering as bad as anyone from the affordable housing crisis, and where it's quite evident that the goal of the restriction is to keep out undesirable people, on that type of record, I would take into any state court in America and argue that there is no rational basis.
I'm really curious to hear what David has to say, not just from the YIMBY side of things, but the legal theory background that he has about the distinction between federal and state court.
I mean, so Georgia is such a weird state in a lot of ways. They don't really accept the Erie Doctrine. There's a lot of weird things going on in Georgia court. So my question is actually a little bit more in throwing it back into your camp, which is, one of the things that's notable in the other case is how much resources you devoted to this one particular case that's going to produce a few homes. I mean, it's great. I'm supportive. But the question is, how do you make this in any way replicable, particularly if you're going, one of the challenges in this case is that you're not getting a ruling that minimum size is just unconstitutional. You're getting a very contextual decision, it seems. And so what kind of plan could you have to make this anything other than dropping in and not dropping in, exact opposite of dropping in, just spending an extraordinary amount of resources to win some small victories?
So this is a question that kind of goes to the core of the blueprint of public interest constitutional litigation. We got here, I think, over a period of roughly 100 or so years post-Euclid, and it's going to take us a while to reverse some of the bad law that exists in this area. And we do it methodically, brick by brick, one victory at a time. A win in a case like this one, I would submit, would have been unthinkable 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And so, to my knowledge, this is the first case in the country striking down on constitutional grounds a minimum square footage requirement. So it's a slow march, but it's one that we hope will gain steam. There are a lot of people in this room who are working on this. We're obviously working on it. And so I think the answer is, over a period of decades, I do believe this will become replicable.
If Charlie Gardner's here, I'm not sure he's here. He's had some interesting. There was a bunch of litigation like this in the 50s on minimum lot sizes, and a few courts, Pennsylvania, found some real limits on minimum lot sizes, but everyone kind of eventually rolled over on it. But again, that's where the game is here, because I mean, minimum unit sizes is important. It's it's a useful thing, and it's mostly in dense areas, but minimum lot sizes is probably the single most important restrictive land use regulation.
That's true. And one of the other things that the court said here, or at least that was in play here, that I also think is replicable and repeats itself throughout the country, is the nature of the government interest was patently to keep out people of lower income who were deemed undesirable. And while this specific minimum square footage law might not exist in every locality in America, that interest is in play nearly everywhere. And the closer that we can get to getting a court to say that is categorically illegitimate is big.
So thank you all to our panelists for joining us here today at YIMBYTown. As always, we'll have links to these cases, or if there's not an opinion, at least information about the cases and controversies for our listeners to go to. And for people here, when our episode comes out 2 Fridays from now. So wait for that. But in the meantime, please be sure to follow Short Circuit on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all other podcast platforms. And remember to get engaged.